while we fix some technical difficulties. Oh, okay. Good afternoon, all. Thank you for taking your time to attend our last activity for this year's Archifuture. Our guest lectures today are on two studios that explored restorative architecture in different contexts. I am Joey, a senior year architecture and sustainable design student, and I'll be moderating this session. Today we have with us Professor Daniel Joseph, Assistant Professor Peter Ortner, and Associate Professor Kang, joined by their student Ashley. For today, Prof Daniel will be presenting on the vertical urban shophouses studio first, followed by Professor Peter and Kang on the Tanjong Pagar Railway Station studio. We will then end off with a Q&A session. During these presentations, please switch off your microphones and videos at all times until the Q&A session is begins. If you have any questions during any of the lectures or after, you can send them in through this QR code or through the link that will be sent in the Zoom chat. With that, let's begin the lecture. Prof, then is everything okay? You're muted right now.
Let me, please allow unmute. Oops. There, greetings. Thank you so much. I will begin presentation. We welcome all of you here this afternoon. I will begin to share a presentation of 3 students' work from Option Studios. I am Dan Whittaker, senior lecturer in architecture sustainable design, and I'm very happy to be able to show student work, both undergraduate, 1 project, and 2 master's students who worked in a group of 14 students this summer term to investigate the idea of the shophouse in 3 different cities. So we'll begin to look at this project. I think all of us have walked around, hopefully all of us here have in the past traveled to Malacca is where we are. And when we walk down a street with these wonderful historic shophouses, some of which have been conserved, some of which have not, I think we've passed by perhaps even this street, these kind of missing teeth, these empty spaces in an urban context that are crying out for some help. And when we see this, depending upon the location, whether it's been in a gentrified zone or not, we oftentimes see the idea that it needs some help. And the response in protected districts that have been gazetted is, of course, to respond with a historically appropriate response that fits in with the existing buildings. Perhaps even one could find a historic photograph and then replicate with great care and diligence the building that may have been there in the past. The approach for this summer option studio that we took with the students was to say, if we imagine ourselves and place ourselves in a non-gazetted area, or perhaps in a city that hasn't implemented such conservation laws, how would one respond differently? And also, how would one respond with an eye towards the future, saying perhaps a 2- or a 3-story building would not adequately serve the needs of the community as far as a density that would be appropriate or cognizant of the needs of the space. And so here we are, again, as I said, in Malacca, in an unfortunate gap, which clearly there was some kind of fire, and there's this temporary barrier. So next time you're walking down the street as a person who hopefully will join us in architecture sustainable design in the future, imagine yourself as an architect graduating from SUTD in several years from now and being responsible for filling in this lacunae in an urban context. So that is the premise. So one response would be low density, small, perhaps even fitting the historic character of what was. The other response would be perhaps larger. And that's what we're going to look at and explore through 3 student projects this afternoon. So we'll begin, as you can see, these are somewhat radical contemporary projects. As I said, the assumption that we're moved forward with the students was not in a protected gazetted area. So we're going to first look at Naomi Wang in her project, which explored form making through the examination of existing patterns and colors in a Peronican context. And we'll see further how she did this. So looking at the site, we're here in Singapore, we had students had choices of 3 different cities to explore. And we're going to look at first Singapore, then Chicago row house configuration, and then finally end in Malacca. So beginning in Singapore, hopefully a site we're familiar with, we can see this conserved district. And the assumption was there was an area that needed the lacunae filled in. And how would a response to this in a higher density configuration make sense? So we're going to see what kind of background did Naomi work with before she arrived at this final conclusion. Well, we went through a very traditional design process. That is, in this case, for the purpose of this, how would one go about making sure there's an adjacency matrix, space bubble diagram? How would one fit all the components of the program together to ensure that the space is a functional space, not only for moving within, but also for the admission of sunlight? And so part of the design process that Naomi went through is obviously creating this wonderful diagram to move through the building and look at how does sunlight move through the space. So we can see this initial examination of how would one open up a space to admit interior sunlight through rooftop glazing and allow the sunlight to move through as easily as people would move through the building. In this wonderful section cut, this starts to examine both the admission of sunlight for growing of plants, and then obviously for the sustainment of people in a further context in the back area. So the whole idea for this was to look at serving the context of gallery space, retail space for coffee shop, and assembling those together. Now, this summer studio in the current condition we're in was done in using Zoom in an online format. So this is not done in a vacuum. We had to continually meet with everybody, both in a larger context of the 14 of us, and also meet in a one-on-one context to help work out all the design issues. So we're happy to harness all the digital tools possible to communicate and to develop this project. The final review slides, majority of which what we're looking at here today, begin to explore this. And we can see in the 3rd floor level, a regular column spacing, setting up a grid for holding the building structurally up. And the inventive component that Naomi Wang worked on specifically was in this green area, what would both hold art and hold plants. And we said those are 2 kind of somewhat contradictory ideas. In an art museum, you're in a stabilized interior environment. Plants emit moisture. How would you create a matrix to be able to hold one or the other? And that was actually helped guide both this armature for holding art and plants, and also guided the exterior cladding of the building, which we'll see in a moment. So what was that development? Well, we can see here in a wonderful cross-section that she cut through how there is this grid pin system, both to hold a matrix for holding the plants to grow, to be able to water and irrigate the plants, and then collect plants in the base, and then developed in section cut, and these wonderful hand-drawn drawings that Naomi would create, how to incorporate the plants and other components of the building. So the harnessing of both analog tools, hand drawing, and an eventual conversion of some of those drawings into digital format is something that we, again, relish and spend time on at SUTD. As I mentioned before, this grid idea was further pushed. She took her inspiration from looking at these traditional tiles in Peronican homes and abstracted them in this kaleidoscopic-like form and then looked at how would one then change this into a three-dimensional form of depth to admit or prohibit sunlight from entering into the space. So this created this wonderful matrix of various combinations and permutations to play with the sunlight in varying degrees of opacity as one sees at the top, or transparency, openness at the bottom. So again, we've spent a lot of time looking at how would one pair these together and work with them to make this into a both aesthetically pleasing facade and also one that functioned with the interior spaces. And these are Naomi's final renderings for the presentation. So this did not happen overnight. This was a 13-week project of development. So it did take an appropriate amount of time before concluding to this wonderful conclusion with this wonderful diaphanous facade emitting light. And then also then, as you can see with the clear glazing, allowing the exterior pedestrians to be able to glimpse into the building where that sunlight is further penetrating the deeper parts of the structure. Of course, if you have immediate questions, you could add them to the chat. I think we're saving the majority of the discussion for the end. So I will continue on and look at the second project here of 3 projects, this done by master's student Michelle Gao, and we're going to look at her interpretation of the Chicago row house, very different than our time on Arab Street in Singapore, and her insertion of a higher density artist live-work space. So we see this in the neighborhood of Lincoln Park on the north side of Chicago. And so she took, as we all do, spent a lot of time looking at the analysis of the site. We see here a violation of the standard grid system, which is so ubiquitous in America, which obviously, as you can see in this wonderful figure ground study, we are on a street, Wrightwood Avenue, which is curved. Unlike other parts of the grid, we see this large diagonal branching up Clark Street, originating down in the downtown district, the Loop, and there's the Lake Michigan, a freshwater body of water to the east. So Michelle looked at how does one go neighborhood-wise, and how does one then shrink to the site to help influence the actual building. And it was adjacent to, and the reason why this site was chosen and given to the students in this elevational context was a Tadao Ando project I had worked on a few years ago, is just a few blocks down. And so these elevations were provided to the students, and then they expanded their ideas from that point. And she chose, as we see, 675 as the location to reconstruct. So again, the idea was no, because it's not a gazetted district, and the students had to build at a higher density to accommodate future needs of more urbane living in this context. So drew an axonometric, went through a traditional design study method. We see here space bubble diagrams, the relationship of public versus private, how different spaces would connect, and Michelle did these beautiful graphics that illustrated her design thinking. Further than looking at spaces and examining them in sectional ability to cut through that row house and examine the different spaces, how would one move through, what spaces should link to one another, what spaces were more private. One can see the word bedroom here, again, like we said, artist, live, work. So there's a component of artists cloistering themselves away, and then other places that were more publicly accessible for the examination and inspection. So as I mentioned before, it was a virtual studio. We had to work together intensively on Zoom to communicate ideas and negotiate what were the values that Michelle had that influenced how does she design. We see these wonderful accents. So as I mentioned before, the key component that she zoomed in on that she found very unique for this area was this bay window, this tripartite 3-component, a narrow window flanking either side at a 45-degree angle, and then a large picture window fixed in the center. And how did this interesting element contribute to the design, and how could one utilize this in a variety of forms? And that is what governed her exploration, that both for a lighted mission, as far as windows are concerned, and also circulation as well. So again, in a very beautiful, like super graphic section describing the uses of the individual spaces within, we can see here. And the unique configuration of this strange, what we call an English basement, which you can see is partially underground, partially above, due to the high water table of the freshwater Lake Michigan nearby as part of the original building. So this is not just a rehabilitation of an existing 3-story row house. It was the expansion of that building, as we see here in a full 5 stories above that English basement configuration. So again, we love to work in both hand drawing to sketch out ideas and in digital terms. And so this is part of the impetus of the studio for students to be able to be comfortable in both idioms of hand, analog, and digital drawing. So here's a section drawing from Michelle of her earlier ideas of how does one occupy this bay window to look out onto the public street and moving it. So again, I'm very happy that with digital technology tools today, we can work together to help better identify the needs of the program, help to better identify the technical solutions necessary to keep the rain out and to do appropriate structure to hold a building up. So we can see this wonderful conversation that, in this case, Zoom allowed us to do, to annotate drawings and talk about what it was that would work best for creating a building that would technically function properly. So interior details that Michelle was able to take time to go to this depth was to actually look at such things that one would come up in very close contact with. She abstracted this geometry of the bay into an actual reception desk, a point of sale for purposes of actually selling the artist's creations within the building, and then created these beautiful renderings moving up. These are just a few samples of a more elaborate final review that Michelle assembled together, seeing both interior and exterior spaces of this 45-degree angle, looking out to a balcony of this small library. So this building, we can see, plays homage to some of you who know your history from New York, of course, Marcel Breuer and his Whitney Museum and these different perforations, but taken to a new level of utilization within the context of the row house. So hopefully some of you who have been can go and walk down next time you're in Chicago and imagine what kind of possibilities could happen in these spaces. Our third and final project, as promised, is a master students, Eunice, who looked, again, we'll return to where we started, Malacca, and how to reinterpret higher density lodging within this context. So again, these elevations of existing blocks of real buildings, but reimagined altogether, were issued to the students, and a small boutique hotel was what was reimagined for a corner site that Eunice examined. So again, traditional methods of how does one space plan and actual needs of a small scale hotel with different amenities for guests, wonderful kind of exploded axonometric in layers was assembled here together. And a lot of time was spent on what should actually be the exterior cladding of the building. And we're looking at actually explored 3 different options to see what would be most appropriate for this site. So traditional method, that being, as we see here, space bubble diagram, thinking about how does one say, where does one start out with a visit to a hotel? We've all gone through this ritual of transient lodging, as it's called, and moved through different spaces. What are served spaces by service staff? What are visited spaces by guests? What spaces are accessible to everybody visiting for events versus private spaces being guest rooms themselves. So this traditional design method, exhaustive in its planning space bubble diagram, as you see here, again, this traditional role of an adjacency matrix to see what needs to be close to one another and what does not. And then in this case, Eunice had spent a time during her internship at an architecture firm to really hone her CAD and Revit skills. And so this is where she excelled in her development of the ideas of how does one move away from this, as we see this traditional floor plan that would have been issued, and then reincorporate an entirely new structure to create a hotel. So as I mentioned, spent a lot of time on the cladding. In other words, this is a building with a screen-like shell around it, and had these wonderful spaces in between the actual building that was weather tight, and what we call a rain screen wall, something that is both a shell, but also lets moisture or air in between the two spaces. And that is indeed what Eunice looked at accomplishing. So as I mentioned, huge skill set developed through internship using AutoCAD and Revit to fully develop this plan, and obviously also include interior furnishings in this regard. The exterior was a lot of time we spent looking at what would be both appropriate for the site and what would also be appropriate for giving adequate privacy for the individuals within. As we see, you can certainly read, the idea of cladding this with a huge brick shell, but especially want to concentrate on, we can see the word filigree. That, of course, would be, in this case, opening up the brick wall and allowing light. So in other words, separating how the brick is laid up and adhere to one another so that there's actual openings and spaces between the brick to allow filtered light to enter in was one option. Second was much more, we call it béton brut, the idea of this huge amount of concrete that explored, and ADM started in the 60s and earlier, which were these huge slabs of concrete within these very colorful elements, both protruding and perforating the building was one second exploration. And then the third was galvanized steel mesh to prevent rust, but that would allow for plants, as you can clearly see, to grow up and dangle down from the building. So before that full exploration was done, of course, ensuring parts of the interior fit together the way they should to ensure circulation for a boutique hotel, to ensure circulation for guests, for events, were necessary for us to meet and exhaustively ensure would work. So the final conclusion that Eunice came to some of this was, as you can see, both opaque brick walls and then perforated screen brick walls that would allow that translucent light to shine through, but give guests some degree of security in terms of visual filter or screen from the street and sidewalk below. So here's one of the side street elevations showing that transparency of the brick that would work quite well for again, giving guests some degree of privacy. For the interior, we can see this entry portal for the entry lobby. Eunice spent a lot more time ensuring that this had more transparency toward the street, and then this hide and seek between the pedestrian and the interior occupant that would occur. So this particular angle shows that very nice transparency of the brick that I had mentioned that Eunice spent a lot of time ensuring would have this interstitial space that was as equally valuable as that exterior shell for providing dynamic architectural experiences. In section view, very different view of what would be opaque, in other words, solid concrete floors, partition walls that would allow for, say, fire exiting within a fire exit staircase. And Eunice went to the actual detail of pillows, light fixtures, obviously quite exhaustive in her investigation, and adept to ensure that a design vision could be then estimated for cost, construction, and then finally built by laborers. So again, this conversation we have with one another constantly back and forth in terms of how does one technically make this work was utilized through the Zoom portal for us to talk about how does one technically make sure this works properly. So as I mentioned, the time that Eunice had spent in her internship greatly informed the level of detail she chose to bring this project to, which, as we see for interior elevations, was quite exhaustive Of course, in Singapore, we utilize the talents of teams to do other components of drawings. What we want to stress is that, of course, the architect in charge, the design architect, needs to be as adept in reading a set of, in this case, construction documents that UNIS wanted to create to make sure there are no errors when a team collaborates to do things together in the real world. Final section detail showing this idea again of incorporation of this planter and an exterior building screen to make sure the two can literally feed energy, light, and water toward one another in this balcony condition. So through this, I hope I communicated in the last 23 minutes here the in-depth, the final projects. This is after students work together work on these projects and as a larger group of 14 on 14 different proposals in 3 different cities and 3 different countries. How does one reinterpret the row house at a higher density? And we're happy to use our digital tools to ensure we could all communicate design ideas to one another. So with that, I conclude with my last slide. Hopefully gave a good sampling of what we do at ASD and here at SUTD to ensure the design creativity is unleashed, as we could say cliche almost, but want to say that this is interpretation of how does one reuse historic spaces that are in need of higher density can find very different responses, and the students explored that with great prowess. So I believe again we're saving our questions toward the end. Correct? Yes.
Thank you, Prof. Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
So as we wait for Prof. Peter to get his slides ready, you guys can, I guess, think about any questions that you might have and send them in to the link in the Zoom chat. Yeah, and we will address them right after the next presentation. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Joey. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, it's good.
Okay. And can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay. Well, hello, everyone, and a big welcome to Restorative Architecture. It's a pleasure to welcome you online to SUTD. Today, Professor Kang Shua and I, and Ashley Chen, one of our students, will be sharing with you a bit about a recent studio that we taught here at SUTD, imagining the future of one of Singapore's national monuments, the Tanjong Pagar Railway Station. This is an opportunity for us to introduce you to the way technology has revolutionized our ability to study and design heritage buildings. But we also want to give you an insider's view on what it is like to be one of our architecture and sustainable design students here at SUTD, to show you some of the perks and special opportunities our students have, and also how our technology-oriented design culture prepares our students to be leaders in the design of the built environment. Professor Kang Shua will be starting us off with an introduction to the history of Tanjong Pagar Railway Station and its importance to the future planning of Singapore.
All right, thank you, Peter. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Kang Shua, and then like what Peter has mentioned, I'll give you a brief overview of the history of Tanjong Pagar Railway Station so that you can appreciate what the studio endeavors to do. Right. So this image that you're looking at is the station, the Tanjong Pagar Railway Station. Is actually started in construction in 1929 and completed in 1932. So it's a good 90 years have passed since. When it was first constructed, it was considered very modern for its time, constructed in reinforced concrete with what we call a Shanghai plaster finish, which is a granular aggregate finish on the surface of the facade. And on the monumental facade that we see here, there are actually tetra style, which has 4 pylons, each displaying allegorical white Carnara marble sculpture from the studios of Raul Bigazzi, Florence. And each of these statues represent the symbol of Malaya economic pillars, namely agriculture, commerce, transport, and industry. And I mentioned Malaya because at the time, Singapore and Malaysia, Peninsular Malaysia, was still under the British Empire, and we collectively known as Malaya. And these four allegory sculptures actually represent the reason why the station is actually being built in 1932, mainly to transport agriculture produce, commerce, and industry produce from the hinterland of Singapore, which is Peninsular Malaysia, to Singapore for further export throughout the world. So next, please, Peter. The station is actually entered under this the portico you've seen earlier, and supported by four large arches into a big reinforced concrete central hall in this image. And this hall, we have a very vault roof, and on either side of this hall, where we look up, there are actually waiting rooms, post office, restaurants, bars, hairdressing salon, etc., etc. On the staircase on the side, will give access to the upper floors. And in the upper floors, we have hotel rooms, which houses the Tanjong Pagar Railway Station Hotel. Here, the central piece of this central hall is actually a set of 18 murals made by Royal Dalton and Company in UK, designed by the architect Dennis Sentry of Shua and McLaren. And Shua and McLaren, the architectural firm that designed this building, is still in existence today in Singapore. Right? So, in addition to the cavernous hall with the 18 panels, Royal Dalton panels, we have actually a 4-face bronze clock that hang from the Vera Vault Hall. Unfortunately, this clock is no longer in existence in the station. Next, please, Peter. So the next image that we see is this is a bird's eye view of the Tanjong Pagar Railway Station. The image is taken probably around 1970s. Singapore, you can see in the far ground, you can see some of the newer HDB flats being constructed in those era. And this is actually a very nice image of the railway station, because it's actually the vicinity is still relatively unblocked from the Empire Dock area of Tanjong Pagar Docks Ways. Right? Today, you have a vehicular viaduct that separates the dock from the Tanjong Pagar Railway Station. Next, please, Peter. So if we go back slightly back into history, the railway line in Singapore existed much earlier than the station in 1932. The railway line station in Singapore started actually in 1903, a good 30 years before the construction of the Tanjong Pagar Railway Station. And the railway line started from Kranji, even prior to the construction of the causeway. So the railway lines actually stopped at the Johor Bahru, and one will have to take a ferry, cross the Straits of Johor, and then continue the railway journey down. And the terminal station then was actually known as a Singapore Station near Tang Road, not at Tanjong Pagar. It's actually in around 1929 to 32 that there's a realignment of the railway line that resulted in the construction of Tanjong Pagar Railway Station. The realignment represents a couple of things. Number one is that they want to have a direct linkages between Tanjong Pagar Railway Station to the docks, right? The shipping docks for further export of the goods overseas. The second is that actually to resolve a perennial problem of flooding throughout the lines, mainly in the Bukit Timah area. And prior to the realignment, the railway lines actually run alongside with Bukit Timah Road and Danian Road. With the new alignment, alignment actually turned 90 degrees perpendicular to Bukit Timah and Danian Road, which today, if you visit the Bukit Timah railway station and the railway station, railway truss bridge area in Bukit Timah, King Albert Park area, you'll see the new alignment is dated back to 1932. Next, please. Thank you. So with that, in 2011, a historical event took place, and that's the return of the railway land back to Singapore, concluding many decades of bilateral diplomatic relationship negotiation with Malaysia over the railway land. So when the last train pulled out of Singapore in 2011, the land actually revert back to the control of the Singapore state. And with that, the Singapore government gazetted this station, Tanjong Pagar Railway Station, as a national monument, signifying the importance in the development of the railway lines, a contribution to commerce and the development of the city port state to the identity of Singapore. Next, please. So in a way, as what this newspaper article says, coming full circle in 2025, and there you can see that on the lower side, the cantonment, there will be an MRT station that will be integrated together with a Tanjong Pagar MRT station, and from a international rail, which is traversing Malaysia and Singapore, it will somehow turn itself into a commuting station as part of a MRT station or cantonment station. Back to you, Peter. Thank you.
Sure, thanks so much, Kang Shua. So with the construction at Cantonment Station, this is more or less all that you can see of the Tanjong Pagar Railway Station today. This is as close as you can get. It's closed to public, it's under restoration. This is what it looks like from above. And here's a view of the MRT construction just behind the station where the historic tracks originally stood. So the idea for this studio was conceived in partnership with Singapore's National Heritage Board and the technology company Dassault. And we were concerned that the public might begin to forget the railway station, forget the national monument during this long period of renovation. And what we thought was that perhaps technology could assist in bringing the station back into people's minds and preserving it in our memories. So here's our question: how can we preserve the memory of the city through our monuments? And our goal here was really to use technology. How can technology allow us to experience a monument more fully, even when we're not able to visit in person? And this was specifically through VR technologies that we were interested in allowing people to see the station and reimagine it during the period of time when it's closed to the public. And the first step in this process was to create a digital model of the station. And for this, we worked with our partners using a slew of new technologies. These are new technologies that have made it possible to document heritage buildings with a level of precision that was impossible only a few years ago, including, for example, LIDAR scans.
Yes, so let us take one step backwards again regarding technology, and why are we interested in technology with historic building? Like I mentioned in the slide here, architecture education old versus new. In the old architecture traditions of learning from buildings of the past is actually very old, very ancient, as early as how architecture education start. We look at building, we go to visit sites, we make drawings, and when we have cameras, we take photographs of the buildings, we take measured drawings, we measure them, draw them out into architectural drawings, and all the process of doing all this help us to understand existing building and learn about architecture, especially proportion. In the modern world, drawings and representation is being disrupted. The invention of digital cameras and various type of technology make documentation drastically different. And the idea of being able to document complex geometry, which is a challenge prior to the invention of photography, takes on a different dimension. Next, please, Peter. So one of the easiest technology that we can use for students, which unfortunately, we did not manage to do that for this particular studio as a result of COVID, as well as the station is not open for public access, is that this idea of photogrammetry. Photogrammetry is one of the easiest low threshold technology, low threshold as in terms of cost, that anyone that has a camera, just any camera, even a camera on a smartphone will do. The only consideration is that the photograph that you take has to be sharp. And you take a series of photographs, which each photograph with at least 1/3 overlapping from the next photograph. And this is input to a software. And increasingly, a lot of software companies are making free access to students with a .edu account, right? So all students from SUTD or any students in Singapore can actually sign up for this particular software for free by many different software companies. And what this software did is actually mathematical because of the overlaps in the photograph, creating a stereo effect. They are able to calculate the XYZ axis dimension to create a 3D model. Next, please. Apart from all this technology that we have, the digital photogrammetry technology, which is actually a very low threshold kind of technology, which is accessible to everyone, the next level in scale is almost similar to what the Kinect games that you play in video games. Is actually making use of RGB, or we can call it a structured light scanning. It actually sends structured light pulses, and once the light hits a object, it reflects and obtains a reflectance to create a 3D data, right? The one on the left, that is the state-of-art scanning technology that we have used for this particular studio, is what we call LIDAR scanning or laser scanning. It is high resolution, relatively easy to operate, but it has a very high threshold, as in the cost of the machine, as well as the amount of data that require post-processing, which perhaps later Peter can also talk a little bit about the processing of the LIDAR data provided by the Singapore Land Authorities to our students. So with this is actually a very short overview of 3 different types of scanning technologies that are available right now to anyone in the market. And in SUTD, I'm happy to say that within ASD, we have a number of LIDAR scanners. And of course, for digital photogrammetry, anyone that has a camera will be able to carry out digital photogrammetry exercise. Thank you. Back to you, Peter.
Thank you, Kang Shua. So our students this term were working with this data set that was provided to us by our partners, for example, at the Singapore Land Authority. And we were also working with a series of software tools from Dassault Software. We were actually sponsored by Dassault. We did a week-long series of tutorials, and they assisted us in creating recreating the geometry of the station and adding texture maps and creating VR walkthroughs. Dassault was also a partner in some of the modeling. So for example, we mentioned that there was a LIDAR point scan, which comes in as a point cloud. And there is a sculpting team at Dassault that recreated some of the sculptures on the facade using that point cloud. This image here is what our students created. This is our digital model that we recreated from the files, the historic documentation of the building, before we started adding on textures and materials. And in the past term, our students went beyond simply asking how technology can preserve the memory of a monument like the TPRS, the Tanjong Pagar Railway Station, to asking how technology can assist us in imagining its future, imagining how it can be restored, but also imagining how newly designed elements can best harmonize with this historic context. And our students took on 2 design projects for the Tanjong Pagar Railway Station site. I'm going to tell you about them very rapidly, since we're running a bit low on time. The first design project was at an urban scale, right? That's what we're seeing in the background here. It was at a large scale relating to the outside of the building. And what we'll look at after this is a design project at a small scale, a pop-up transport museum that's on the interior of the railway station main hall. This allowed us to address the building both at a large scale and at a small scale. So in the first design studio, our students looked specifically at the urban surroundings of the railway station and studied how a new building might be created near the station. And these studies were looking specifically at the density of this building and how we could test different scenarios for the density using the VR tool. We mapped what heritage elements still exist around the building and which ones have been removed. We looked at how the changes in public transport at the station are going to change the way that we perceive, visit, and move through the station. And we looked at larger urban networks, in particular the green space networks like the rail corridor and how that connects into the rest of the city, the Park Connector Network and the coming Greater Southern Waterfront. And with this information, our students were able to formulate designs that could kind of fit into this larger urban understanding of the role of the Tanjong Pagar Railway site in the city. The current URA master plan, which we're looking at here, foresees a plot ratio of 4.2 for the site. And with a site of 38,000 square meters, that's what we're seeing in blue here, that would result in about 150,000 square meters of additional built area, which is a very large building. It's actually bigger than Iron Orchard, for example. And the challenge to our students was to create a parametric model, which could create a series of design options and allow us to test these different densities to ask how high should it be, how wide, is 4.2 the right number for the site? And then to use the VR tool to get a perceptual level view of this, to understand how it would work, how it would feel to be on site with these different design variations. So here's an example. This is a design strategy from one of our students. It's a starting point from our students Wai-Hin, Megan, Shruti, and Michelle. The idea here was to take the density of the building, the mass of the building, and shape it into a ramp that would bring the rail core up onto the roof of the building and then connect it into other parts of the city. And here you can see 4 of the different variations that they created with their parametric model. And these are looking at, yes, different densities, right? But they're also looking at different heights, different proximities to the building, how close it is to the historic station. And they're also looking at different configurations for the ramping, how it can connect to Spottiswoode Park to the north and to the Greater Southern Waterfront to the south. This is an overhead view. This is a sort of very objective view, and it's giving us the data points, right? We're looking at, here we can see for each variation, we see the gross floor area, the plot ratio, the maximum building height, etc. A series of physical built models gave us a more tangible means of exploring these options and comparing them, something you can pick up with your hand and look at. And then digital renderings allowed us to understand what perception at street level would be like for somebody visiting the site. But we wanted to go further to understand what this street level perception would be like. And so we took the VR tools that Dassault had shared with us, and we created this little demo for how it could work. So our setup here is with an HTC Vive and the Dassault 3D Experience software. This is Wai-Hin doing the demonstration. Here's one of the student projects. And you can see we created a custom interface, these balls in the sky here. And by clicking between them, we can switch between different dense tower arrangements or different densities of tower arrangements, going from denser to less dense and seeing how it's perceived on site. Wai-Hin's looking back to the station now, and now up at the tower. And he's checking a perspective that's closer to the building here, checking how the silhouette of the building compared to the silhouette of the historic heritage station harmonizes in the VR environment. So this is a nice way for us to preview what the building would be like if it were actually built and help us to decide how densely could we or should we build on the site. This is what our review looks like, right? So here our students are presenting to our panel of critics. This is just a few months ago, it's still socially distanced. And you can see on the screen on the right, we have this sort of objective data-driven view from above. On the left, we were doing the VR demonstration. And then the jury are holding the models in their hands and looking at them during the discussion. So we're able to have this very rich discussion about the future of the site through these different media and through the opportunities that the technology has afforded us. The second design problem was in the interior of the station, like I explained. Transport has been central to the history of Tanjong Pagar Railway Station. And in this second design problem, we challenged our students to create a pop-up museum to explain the transport history of the museum, a transport museum. And they were asked to test the experience of these designs through VR software and via a walkthrough animation. And to explain her design or her team's design for this museum, we've asked Ashley Chen to join us. Ashley, are you there?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, Ashley, yes, speak up. You're a little bit soft.
Hello.
Hi,
Is it
Ashley, go
better?
ahead.
Okay. So for our interior pavilion, my team decided to use like films that are shot at TPRS as our artifact to drive the design of the pavilion. So we chose these 3 films that were obtained from the Singapore Film Locations Archive website and based on their locality to the site. So the films chosen showcases the importance of the station as these characters use TPRS as a driver for their respective narratives. So on the left, you see the film Sergeant Hassan, which is an action film about a soldier using the train to Malaysia for war. In the middle, you see the film Anakku Sazali. So it's about an eloped couple that finds comfort and community as they use the cafeteria in the station for a space to foster friendships. And last but not least, we have Juwita, which is a romance film about a long distance relationship between a traveling musician and a Singaporean woman. Next. Yeah, so we deconstructed these films into 9 important keyframes according to their location and their timestamp in the movie. And then we also highlighted the scenes that were shot at the PRS as such. And given the small space of the hall, the challenge our team faced was how to design a pavilion that would complement the geometry and the overall look of the space without it being too overwhelming. Next slide, Prof. And because of that, we decided to convert the films into CMYK colors. Next. And then we superimpose them onto one another. And in this way, what seems at first to be like this array of colors is unraveled as the user journeys into the pavilion and sees the colorful films in a red filter. Next slide. A red filter, and then next, a green filter, and followed by a blue filter. Next. Yeah, next slide, please. So the superimposition allows for the optimization of the space as we are able to have 3 exhibitions in one. Next slide, Prof. So in each of the 3 films, there'll be 1 frame out of the 9 that is filmed within TPRS, and this informs the location of the entrances and exits into the pavilion. Since these views are scattered around TPRS station, a spiral form was chosen not only to provide visitors with a 360 view of the station, but also allows us to frame the 3 key views. So this allows the visitors to see an overlay of the old TPRS and the new TPRS, and hopefully bring back the feelings of nostalgia and to show the contrast between the new and the old station. Next slide. So this slide shows a conceptual section of what my team imagined the pavilion to appear with the curated viewpoints as seen on the 2nd and 3rd floors of the pavilion. Next slide. So this is an exposure exo of the pavilion. The color film layer is encapsulated with like white steel fins that allows for easy assemblage, as well to also diffuse the vibrancy of the colored film to give the pavilion like a very light feel that will blend into the backdrop, the white backdrop of the station. So the last layer is then a translucent polycarbonate sheet that will wrap the entire pavilion so that the users walking on the outside, they become the moving successive images for the users who look at a pavilion from the outside. Next slide. So this is a render of our pavilion during the day. The pavilion becomes a film reel that withholds the stories of the past while creating stories of the present from the motion of the users. We felt that the cylindrical geometry could complement the angular perimeter of the hall, and most importantly, bring out the arches of the existing barrel vault. And next slide. So this is the night render, and at night, the colors of the red, green, and blue lighting will illuminate the hall and guide the users to the top of the TPRS station to have a closer look at the murals. And next. Next slide.
This is the animation.
Oh, well, there was another. There's supposed to be another, another one, but
sorry, that's all I have actually.
Yeah,
Should
but
I put
okay.
the animation?
Yeah, sure. Okay. So this is what the pavilion looks like upon entering the station. So on this level, we have the Pepper's Ghost, which is how we show the hologram of the old commuter belongings, such as coins, money, and newspapers, onto new belongings of the commuters, such as electronic media and so here on the 2nd and 3rd level, we have the films that will be, we will change the lighting to red, green, and blue such that they're able to see individual films when they go up the pavilion. And last but not least, by going up the pavilion, they are led up to the top floor and they're able to look at the existing murals in TPRS. Yep. Yeah, thank you.
Prof. Peter, you're muted.
Oh, sorry, everyone. I was. Thank you, Ashley. Thank you, everyone. Sorry, we went a bit over.
Yeah, it's fine. Okay, so thank you for both lectures. I thought they were very interesting. So we can now move on to the Q&A session. If any of you have any questions, you can send them in through the link in the chat or through the QR code that will be shared on the screen here. Yeah. In the meantime, I will just present the one question already by Leon question, and either any prof can answer this. So the question is, how do these studio projects apply to the architecture industry in Singapore and other countries? And the second part is the industry as forward-looking as SUTD to use the same tech used in these projects? Yeah, anyone want to take it?
You're asking how relevant is it to local industry and international architecture industry? So one thing that's interesting about heritage is that the heritage of Singapore increases every year, right? So as a future architect working either here or abroad, you increasingly encounter the need to relate your design to the built environment that already exists, right? So it's a really important part of the education of the architect and a really important part of the practice of architecture every day. And your ability to measure, observe, and then relate your design back to that is crucial. The second part of the question is the rest of the industry as forward-looking as SUTD? Absolutely, right? Architecture is a competitive profession, and you gain an advantage through the use of these cutting-edge technologies. That's the primary reason that we emphasize it in the education of our students as a way to help our students be leaders in the profession in the future, to sort of understand what the potential of this technology is, where it's taking the profession, and how they can shape that during their careers.
Well, this is Kang here. May I jump in here? With regards to how does it relate to the world, so if you look at Dan's studio, we have 3 locations, right? Singapore, Malacca, and Chicago. It says, in a way, it sort of answers your question that heritage is actually international. And well, going forward, I will expect that there are a lot more buildings that will be gazetted around the world, not just Singapore. And increasingly, as students of architecture, as architects in practice, you will somehow have the opportunity to work on heritage building or build next to a heritage building. So I think that both studios offers a kind of proposition that, how does one deal with heritage directly or indirectly, right? Thank you.
And to briefly add, the notion that, of course, Singapore and our graduates in SUTD will provide that future leadership for what kind of vision is necessary to both reshape how do we look at the past, how do we incorporate the latest technologies for assessing architecture and buildings goes hand in hand to move this the profession of architecture forward. So we're very happy to say the answer is affirmative.
All right, thank you. So I guess we can move on to the next question. An anonymous student has asked, how will they, as students who eventually join ASD, how will they be introduced to these technical drawings? Especially, I think Prof Dan, you showed a lot of hand drawings, while Prof Peter and Kang Shua, you guys showed a lot more drawings that were generated from the computer. Yeah, so how would they be introduced to these kinds of drawings?
We can say for those that may be reticent or hesitant about their hand drawing techniques, we have a whole term of a 13-week class for urban sketching, where one hones their tools, whether pen or pencil, watercolor, otherwise, to get more familiar with their ability to represent. That being said, of course, is that everybody also develops their own skill sets. Some find they have better capability with, pen and ink drawing. Others find better abilities with Revit or Grasshopper, other digital programs. You obviously will see that when you're in a class of 14 of your fellow students in the studio, what kind of skills one brings to a project, and then you capitalize on it. You capitalize on your strengths, and then you also learn for both the professor, your fellow classmates, and then how to emphasize the visual tools that allow you to visually communicate to your classmates the best way possible.
And to answer specifically when it's introduced, right? At SUTD, we have 3 core studios, which provide the design fundamentals, the fundamental skills for being an architect, being a designer. Of those core studios, core 1 is where you're introduced for the first time to digital drawing. It's often, in past years, also the first time that students work with a LIDAR scanner and with a LIDAR point cloud for describing the site that they're working in. And that takes place in term 4 for our ASD students.
All right, thank you. So I guess we can move on to another question. Someone wants to know how realistic these proposals usually are. Are the students taught about structures needed and materials needed to help ensure that the systems that they propose in their projects are actually doable? So for example, maybe Prof Dan's example for Naomi's project with the planters and the wall systems, do they actually work so that the plants are able to grow? Yeah, or are they just, are they actual systems, or do students completely hypothesize based on theoretical knowledge of materials? Yeah, that was quite long, but I hope you guys got it.
Certainly. Well, with regards to Naomi, like modular plant wall in that grid matrix, she did not go to the extent of building a 1-to-1 scale prototype, but to hypothesize that would actually work, we certainly take existing materials, that cellular expanded matrix that is a substitute for soil, existing irrigation systems. So we take existing technologies that we know work in other plant wall installations and say, okay, what is the diameter of the tube? How many planters can be fed by a water source? How much light do the plants need? What is adequate drainage for the area? So it's existing products that we know are out there that are for plant walls, and then readapted to a custom assembly, which is what she went to a great technical extent to draw and render in both section and elevation. So it's some off-the-shelf building and materials that we know function well, and then customizing their application to ensure that as an architect and architecture student, it will assemble together and not leak, and then function as it should.
Yeah, so in our studio, we had design projects at 2 scales. One was an urban design project, and there you're looking at a different set of factors. You're not really looking at the structural analysis of the building yet. You're really looking at the urban massing, and the determining factors there are like gross floor area, right? Plot ratio. Those are the things that I mentioned. In the second project, this was a project about a small pavilion, and we talked a lot about structure, about materials, because one of the ideas of the pop-up museum is that it's meant to be disassemblable. It's meant to last a period of time, and it's meant to be installed without damaging the heritage context, and then be able to be disassembled and taken away after a period of time. So with Ashley and with our partners, Linus and Zhesheng, who I think are in the audience right now, we had a long series of talks about what the structure was for this project and how we can push it to meet their aesthetic needs, right? How slim can it get to give it this sort of diaphanous facade and yet still be believable. So I think we go into a lot of detail, both on structure, materials, and constructability in our studios.
All right, thank you. While answering any of these questions, if any of the participants have any follow-up questions, you also may unmute yourself to follow up if it's easier for you. Yeah. In the meantime, we will carry on to the next question. So how do the profs help the students on the process of deciding how much to preserve and how much to change when it comes to a conservation project?
Okay, I'll attempt to answer this question. This is actually a very difficult question to ask because there are many scenarios that we can take upon. In a real life situation where the buildings are gazetted, the state will tell you what you can do and what you cannot do, right? But of course, as architects, we always need to challenge the norm. All right, we should not be taking what the state tell you, what you can do and what you cannot do, and take it as face value. We should always challenge it. And the most important thing in terms of heritage is that what is best for the heritage? We need to ask ourselves before we intervene in a historical site, what is the heritage significance of the site? By imposing a new design on the site, are we changing or detracting or negating some heritage significance? So that's the first question. And is our intervention contributing to a new experience of the site? All right, so that's the next question. These are two important questions and very difficult question to answer. In the studio setting, all right, I think it's a very different consideration altogether. The studio may consider, okay, let's do away with all the heritage consideration, but let's do a high contrast. So that's one way a studio can take can proceed. The other way, the other extreme is that let's be very conservative and be highly respectful of the heritage. But in most cases, I would say that studios tend to dwell somewhere in between, right? With referencing to heritage, but trying to push the boundary of not blindly preserving for the sake of preserving, right? So I'm not too sure if I answered the question. I think there's a very broad and very big issues, and I think this kind of questions or these issues will stay throughout an architect throughout the career of the architecture, because the definition of heritage changes all the time, right? What is heritage to you may not be heritage to me, right? And it differs from generation to generation. I think every generation need to continuously ask this question so that we can articulate and agree to disagree on what is heritage to us. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Kang. We actually have another question kind of similar from Mok. I'm not sure whether you want to follow up because it's a bit more specific and I guess maybe more of your personal opinion. Mok wants to know what is the best way to retain Singapore's culture and identity despite Singapore's rapid urbanization. Any opinions on that?
Right. Okay, this is again a very big question, right? So, well, certainly your generation experienced Singapore very differently from my generation. And I think what is important is that we should keep every buildings of, at least speaking from a bias towards built heritage, buildings from every era, we should say some samples of it. So it's sort of a kind of visual anchors and memories of our identity, right? If you look at the government, what the URA as well as the National Heritage Board have conserved as national monuments as well, conserved buildings, they are essentially conserving the relatively more historic buildings, right? The colonial buildings, buildings of religious, for example, churches, mosques, temples, right? synagogues. But we have very little relatively more modern building, with the exception of a couple. For example, the Jurong Town Corporation building, the Singapore Conference Hall building, right? And all these buildings are essentially state-owned buildings, so it's easy to conserve, right? If you look at my virtual background, that is actually a very recent and perhaps more famous case, the Golden Mile complex, right? And why such buildings are difficult to conserve, because it is difficult because of many reasons. Number one, people have different perception of the building, personal aesthetics. Some may find exciting, interesting, beautiful. Some may call it a slum, ugly, dirty, right? So public perception is one, but being ugly is not a definition of heritage value. I certainly do not think that aesthetic does alter any heritage value. I think that one of the main challenges is actually, it has nothing to do with architecture. The challenge has got to do with real estate values, as well as legal issues. Being strata titled means that there are hundreds of owners. For hundreds of owners agreeing for conservation and not to monetize by selling out to the next highest bidder to redevelop the site is actually a very difficult thing to do. So moving off from this modern heritage, what is forms of identity? I would put a case here for our HDB estates, right? HDB is everywhere. Most of us live in HDB estates, and can HDB defines the identity of Singaporeans? I would certainly say yes, right? Back to what I mentioned earlier in my earlier answer to the earlier question, is that it's up to every individual of us to define what defines ourselves as an individual, and what defines ourselves as a collective group of people, as well as the nation. So it starts from the individual, right? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Prof. I guess for all of us, these are opinions that we can also form ourselves as we go through our career studying architecture. So due to a lack of time, we will go through one last question, which is more about the syllabus. So the question is about whether or not these option studios that both Prof. Dan and Prof. Peter and Kang Shua have talked about, are they like a a permanent studio, or is it a one-off thing? So if they were to join ASD, will they be doing these same exact briefs in the future, or is it ever changing?
Well, to begin, it is ever changing. In other words, we adapt and find new themes to explore from one studio to another. In future studios, one upcoming this spring term, we're looking at a waterfront area near the old, what was a Klang airport, is no longer, of course. So the places that we explore change and move around to different neighborhoods of Singapore, different places of Southeast Asia, and then the theme as well. Undoubtedly, of course, having a preference for old buildings and conserving them, I'll certainly in future studio find another locale appropriate for a lot of investigation. The good part is Singapore is the leader for Southeast Asia. There's no shortage of places in need of assistance that we can explore virtually, or obviously in the future, perhaps even in person.
Yeah, so these are option studios. These are one-off. These are unique topics, and these are advanced studios. So as explained earlier, our students go through a core sequence of 3 core studios. Design fundamentals, core 2 is VR currently, core 3 is housing and urban design. And after those 3 fundamental core studios, then you move on to an option studio where you pursue an advanced topic, often with an invited critic. And so that's what these studios are. Is that okay, Joey? Would you have anything to add to that?
No, I think that about sums it up. Yeah. So I guess any prospective students, you can look forward to a wide range of projects while you're here in ASD. Yeah. So I guess if no one else has anything to add, we will move on. So we would like to thank everyone who has joined us today. Diane, you'll go to the next slide. yeah, we would really appreciate if you guys could scan this QR code and provide us your feedback for not only just this Q&A session, but just any of the activities that you may have participated in today for Archifuture, so that because this is the first time we've organized such an event, we would like to potentially plan similar events in the future and have them even better. Yeah, so we can better cater to all of your needs. Yeah. If any of you have any questions regarding admissions to SUTD, or maybe any follow-up questions about whether or not you should join ASD or what the experience is like, you can always go to the SUTD website and email admissions@ASD, or you can also chat with some of our students through the chat board available on the SUTD website. Yeah. With that, we would like to thank all of you for joining us today, and we hope to see you maybe in our open houses or in school itself. Yeah, thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joey. Thank you, Waihen. Thank you, Diane, for organizing this.
Yes.
Great work, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess if anyone else in the call has any questions, you guys can unmute and ask us now as well, if there is any.
Okay, I need to step out, Joey. Thank you again for all your work.
Thank you, Prof. See you next term.
Thank you, everybody.
It was
Goodbye. Thank you.
a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you, Waihen.
Thank
Is that
you.
Matthew? Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you.
Thank you, Diane.
Okay, let's end the meeting here.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.